Well, right now, as you know, all eyes are supposed to be on Annapolis, and I'll come back to that without much enthusiasm. But I'd like to start with a few words on some meaningful events that are taking place at the same time, events that are very timely. In fact, they're supposed to take place today. These events that I have in mind have to do with a tiny village in the Jordan Valley called Fasail. Happens to be right next to the rich and flourishing Israeli settlement of Tomer. Fasail, in contrast, is not flourishing. Its drinking water is rationed by the occupying authorities. It's not allowed to construct or rebuild roads. Electricity is scheduled to be canceled. There's no school in the village, so children have to walk several miles on dangerous paths. The villagers have tried to build a school, but that's banned because the area is designated for Israeli farming, according to the Israeli civil administration. Nevertheless, the villagers are again attempting to build a school, despite an injunction from the occupying authorities to halt building on November 29th, namely as we meet today. Well, there's nothing unusual about Fasail and Tomer. Rather, it's a microcosm of the West Bank. It's the reality of what we should call, if we were honest, the U.S.-Israeli occupation. The Tomers flourish and the Fasails languish thanks to decisions made by Israel's protector in Washington, the boss man called partner, as Israeli political columnist Aleph Ben has accurately described the U.S.-Israeli relationship. That is thanks to you and me, who bear direct responsibility for the Fasails and the Tomers and everything like them. Well, since we're meeting at a famous law school, it's perhaps worth mentioning that Tomer is, of course, illegal, as is every Israeli settlement in the occupied territories. It should not be necessary to debate this, if it ever was, certainly not after the unanimous World Court decision affirming once again that, I'll quote, the Fourth Geneva Convention and international human rights laws are applicable to the occupied Palestinian territory and must therefore be faithfully complied with by Israel so that populations cannot be transferred there, and the segments of the Israeli separation wall being built by Israel to protect the settlements are ipso facto in violation of international humanitarian law. I'm quoting U.S. Justice Bergenthal joining the full court on the crucial issues at stake. That's most of the wall, of course, that he's talking about, maybe 85%. And the same judgment obviously applies to everything to the east of the separation wall, like what's going on in the Jordan Valley. Well, the Fourth Geneva Convention, as you know, was instituted to criminalize formally the crimes of the Nazis in occupied Europe, including transfer of population to occupied territories. And therefore, for anti-Nazis, it's a core principle of international humanitarian law. Its applicability to the Israeli-occupied territories has been repeatedly reaffirmed, just to mention a few times, by UN Ambassador George Bush in September 1971, and by several Security Council resolutions. These include 465 in 1980, adopted unanimously, which condemned U.S.-backed Israeli practices as flagrant violations of the conventions, that is, war crimes. 1322 in October 2000, which called on Israel to abide scrupulously by its responsibilities under the Fourth Geneva Convention, which was again violating flagrantly at that moment. That vote was 14-0, with Clinton abstaining. Well, I'm sure you also know that as a high contracting party, the U.S. is obligated by solemn treaties to apprehend and prosecute those who are responsible for such crimes. That includes its own leadership, of course. But as a self-declared outlaw state, namely immune to international law and norms, the United States need pay no heed to such marginal concerns. In fact, they don't deserve even casual mention. Facts are incidentally well documented recently in two very valuable volumes by international law specialists Howard Friel and Richard Falk, which are much too important to be mentioned or reviewed, but worth reading. The systematic planning that leads to Fasail and Tomer and everything like it was articulated quite lucidly. There's no reason not to know it. In the very early days of the occupation, it was most clearly articulated by Moshe Dayan, who was responsible for the territories, and was also the Israeli leader who was most sympathetic to the plight of the Palestinians. He informed his Labor Party colleagues that Israel should tell the Palestinians that, I'm quoting him, "We have no solution. You shall continue to live like dogs, and whoever wishes may leave, and we will see where that process leads." It's known sometimes as voluntary transfer. And so it's continued. During the Oslo years, U.S.-backed illegal settlements and infrastructure programs continued steadily, undermining any of the comforting words. There was a sharp rise in the year 2000, Clinton's last year, leading to the failed Camp David meetings. Well, these programs accelerated further under Bush #2, who also broke new ground in that he formally declared that in any eventual political accommodation, Israel will keep its major settlement blocks. You might praise him for honesty. That's always been the policy, but he stated it formally. The White House and Congress quite enthusiastically endorsed Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert's convergence plan, as he called it, under which Israel annexes the valuable territory on the Israeli side of the separation wall that happens to include the main water resources of the region, one of the determinants of the path of the wall, and it breaks up the rest into unviable cantons, largely separated from one another and separated mostly from the center of Palestinian life, namely some part of Jerusalem. And all of these are to be imprisoned as Israel takes over the Jordan Valley, and of course includes, controls airspace and every other form of access. This program was later abandoned by the Israeli government as too generous to the Palestinians. That was after Israel's murderous invasion of Lebanon in 2006. That's the fourth U.S.-backed invasion since 1982, none of them with any credible pretext. Well, to ensure that there is no misunderstanding about the meaning of the Annapolis Conference, as it approached, Israel expropriated even more land from the village of Anata near Jerusalem to build a binational ethnic separation highway. That's what it was called in Haaretz, Israel's leading daily. A highway with a 16-foot wall right down the middle to separate Israeli and Palestinian traffic. This massive construction is adjacent to the crucial E1 project, designed to incorporate the town of Adumim within Greater Jerusalem, and effectively within Israel, and that's essentially bisects the West Bank. Another corridor to the north trisects it in effect. This is all in line with Ehud Barak's map, his proposal at Camp David in 2000. If you take a look at the map, that's just what it does. Cuts the West Bank in two, through Ma'ale Adumim into the east, and again through Ariel and other settlements to the north. Anata is already cut off from Jerusalem, to which it's adjacent. It's cut off by the separation wall, and this new monstrosity will almost completely encircle the town, which will therefore be strangled like the dying city of Kalkilia. The Israeli side of the road provides settlers in the West Bank with easy access to Jerusalem and anything beyond in Israel. The Palestinian side, of course, controlled by the Israeli army, has no access to Jerusalem. It's part of the moving those who live like dogs to the east as a form of a step towards voluntary transfer. Well, actions like these, which are taking place all over the West Bank, pale into insignificance in comparison with the savage cruelty of the torture of Gaza. Needless to say, what is taking place in the occupied territories daily is vastly more significant than the words that are exchanged at Annapolis, which in fact are so vacuous that I won't even bother commenting on them. However, what transpired was vacuous. The Annapolis conference is not entirely without interest. One point of interest is the location, the U.S. Naval Academy. There are other meeting places in the Washington area, I'm told, but there's only one that's responsible for sending major battle groups to menace the coasts of Iran. It's a critical component of the criminal threats of force against Iran. Criminal, as everyone who's read the UN Charter knows. It was barely concealed that the purpose of the meeting in Annapolis was to bring together what are called the moderates, that is, the brutal dictatorships and fundamentalist extremists who the United States happens to favor. Those are moderates in conventional discourse. They're supposed to form an alliance against Iran, which has been a hated enemy ever since it broke free of U.S. control in 1979. Assume you know the background, so I won't review it. Iran's refusal to follow orders is now so dangerous that commentators are proclaiming excitedly that we're entering Cold War II as the U.S. seeks to contain Iranian influence, to establish a bulwark against Iran's growing influence in the Middle East, quoting the national press. Well, containing Iranian influence is no small problem. In Iraq, good relations with Iran are welcomed by much of the majority Shiite population. The largely Shiite South is now virtually out of control of the occupying armies with the British withdrawal. It also happens to be the source of most of Iraq's enormous oil reserves. Prime Minister al-Maliki, who's Washington's man in Baghdad, met last August with Iranian Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei and President Ahmadinejad and other senior officials, and he thanked Tehran for its positive and constructive role in Iraq. A few days before that, Afghan President Hamid Karzai, Washington's favorite on the opposite border of Iran, described Iran as a helper and a solution in his country. In Lebanon, according to polls, most Lebanese see Iranian-backed Hezbollah as a legitimate force defending their country from Israel. Polls reported in the Washington Post. In Palestine, Iranian-backed Hamas won a free election, eliciting savage punishment of the Palestinian population by the U.S.-Israeli alliance for the crime of voting the wrong way. It's another notable episode in what's called democracy promotion. And even in the moderate states, so-called, ruled by U.S.-backed tyrants, therefore moderate, sympathy for Iran is unpleasantly strong, so reports indicate. Well, worse yet, Iran has been admitted as an observer to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which also includes Russia with its enormous resources, and the Central Asian states, and has called for removal of the U.S. military presence from the Middle East. U.S. requests to gain an observer status were rejected. And China is even making inroads into the jewel in the crown, namely Saudi Arabia. Moves towards independence that are called Iranian influence in the doctrinal system, these definitely do threaten Washington's control of the world's major energy resources. And to stem that tide, it's worthwhile to take a day off for photo ops and Annapolis, like the front page photo that you saw in the New York Times and elsewhere, showing Abbas and Olmert gazing worshipfully at Sahib as his arms enclosed them. Well, the official story is a little bit different. Just keeping to the newspaper of record, the theme of the lead story before the day before the Annapolis meeting was George Bush's, all quotes, ambitious vision, the two-state peace he has pronounced as his vision, the White House mantra since 2002, two states, Israeli and Palestinian, living side by side in peace and security. Actually, the word vision appears about half a dozen times in the article. That's in accord with a journalistic convention. Previous presidents had ideas and proposals and so on, but George Bush only has visions. Continuing with the received standard version, there are barriers to realizing Bush's vision. One is that Hamas rejects the vision and seeks only the destruction of Israel. Although other Arabs, like the Saudis, are slowly coming along, and the Annapolis meeting is supposed to provide solid evidence of that slow Arab reconciliation. That's Times Jerusalem correspondent Stephen Erlanger. Maybe even the Palestinians will join under the official moderate Mahmoud Abbas. The Palestinians are desperate because they are at a dead end. Times columnist Roger Cohen explains they've been losers over the last 6 decades through ineptitude, corruption, and Arab hypocrisy. That's harmed the Israeli soul, and it has frustrated Washington's best efforts at brokering a settlement. And so it continues without quoting any more. The U.S. is the honest broker. Israel seeks peace, but is threatened with terror and destruction, although some Arabs are slowly beginning to consider the peaceful accommodation for which the United States and its Israeli ally have yearned for so many years, and that has become the White House mantra under Bush. Well, notably missing from the impressive stream of rhetoric are any facts, and there's a good reason for that. Facts are annoying. They're inconvenient. I'll very briefly review the record. This is with apologies for most of you, I'm sure, familiar with the history. So let's begin with the slow Arab reconciliation, which is maybe beginning at Annapolis. Actually, it began 35 years before Annapolis, when Egyptian President Anwar Sadat offered Israel a full peace treaty, in accord with what was then official U.S. policy. This was in return for Israeli withdrawal from the northeast Sinai, Egyptian Sinai, where the labor government, that's the Doves, was violently expelling thousands of farmers, destroying their towns, their mosques, their cemeteries, driving them into the desert to build the all-Jewish city of Yamit and a string of kibbutzim surrounding it. Israel recognized Sadat's proposal to be a genuine peace offer, but decided to reject it. Henry Kissinger won an internal bureaucratic battle in the United States, and the U.S. Adopted his position, which he called stalemate, no negotiations, just force, therefore supported Israel's rejection of the offer. That was a fateful decision, one of the most fateful decisions in the history of this confrontation. And by choosing expansion instead of peace, Israel established the fundamental relation of dependence on a foreign master. And that's a decision that persists with bitter consequences. Well, the slow Arab reconciliation, which began in 1971, continued in 1976, when the leading Arab states brought to the United Nations Security Council a resolution calling for a two-state settlement on the internationally recognized border with guarantees for the security of every state in the region. recognized borders, and so on. The resolution adopted took over the wording of what everyone agrees to be the basic international instrument, UN 242, adding 242 said nothing about the Palestinians, except that they're refugees. This 1976 resolution essentially took UN 242 and extended it to a call for a Palestinian state in the occupied territories. Israel refused to attend the session. Instead, it bombed Lebanon, killing 50 people, scarcely even offering a pretext. It was reported here, but greeted with a yawn. The United States vetoed the resolution. Bear in mind that a U.S. veto is a double veto. One, whatever's vetoed isn't implemented, and secondly, it's vetoed from history, as this one has been. Also another one very much like it in 1980. Well, with the Security Council banned, calls for diplomatic settlement shifted to the General Assembly, where there were annual votes with numbers like 150 to 2, U.S.-Israel, sometimes 3, maybe Dominica or Palau or somebody decided to join. Rarely even ever reported. It's considered too boring. The most striking incident was in 1988-1989. That's when the Palestinian National Council formally accepted a two-state settlement. And Israel did respond. There was a coalition government, Shimon Peres and Yitzhak Shamir. They responded with a declaration that there can be no additional Palestinian state between Israel and Jordan. Additional because Jordan already is a Palestinian state according to the coalition government. That's Shimon Peres, the peacemaker. Furthermore, the declaration stated that the fate of the territories will be settled according to the guidelines of the State of Israel. The United States immediately gave full backing to this proposal. It's the Baker Plan, James Baker, of December 1989. He added only that if any Palestinians are permitted to take part in negotiations, they'll have to accept this framework. Recall that this is the Bush 1 administration. That is the one that's condemned as being anti-Israel. It's taken the most extreme position in support of Israeli expansion and criminality in the occupied territories and against Palestinian rights, the most extreme that anyone has officially taken. Well, as I wrote at the time, I'll quote myself if you don't mind, it's as if someone were to argue that Jews don't merit a second homeland in Israel because they already have New York. Well, I should mention that the extreme racism of the Peres-Shamir-Baker-Bush stand has been recognized right here at the Harvard Law School by a prominent professor, Professor Alan Dershowitz. In his book, A Case for Israel, there's a chapter called A Case Study in Hate and Intimidation, which is intended to demonstrate the power of anti-Semitism and hatred of Israel and Jews, virtual reversion to the Nazis. The chapter heading is the statement, my statement, that it's as if someone were to argue that Jews don't merit a second homeland in Israel because they already have New York. Only one change in the statement. The words, it's as if, are deleted, and the context is omitted. So therefore, a critique of the U.S.-Israel proposal is converted into a vicious anti-Semitic assault on Israel. Well, the deceit is commonplace and uninteresting, but what is interesting is his implicit recognition of the extreme racist stand of Washington and Israel's Labor-Likud coalition. I won't run through the rest of the dismal record. It reveals exactly one departure from U.S.-Israeli rejectionism, an important one, namely in Taba, Egypt, in January 2001, where the Camp David proposals meetings collapsed. Clinton recognized that his proposals at Camp David were unacceptable to any Palestinian, and he came out with what he called his parameters in December 2000, which were vague but more forthcoming. He then stated that the U.S. would support negotiations within the parameters, and then reported that both sides had accepted the parameters, both sides had reservations. They dealt with the reservations for a week in Taba, Egypt, and according to negotiators, they were coming extremely close to a settlement. Their last press conference said that within a few more days they could probably work out everything. However, the Taba meetings were terminated abruptly by Israeli Prime Minister Barak, so that was the end of that one. In 2002, going on with the slow Arab move towards accommodation, the Arab League went beyond its previous acceptance of the international consensus and called for full normalization of relations with Israel within the international consensus. Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khomeini, formally announced that Iran, I'll quote him, shares a common view with Arab countries on the issue of Palestine. Means that Iran accepts the Arab League position, full normalization of relations with Israel in terms of the international consensus. In the Washington Post, Hamas Prime Minister Ismail Haniyeh called for, his word, statehood for the West Bank and Gaza, two-state settlement. And there are innumerable, there are innumerable other examples. Perhaps the most important among them is the statement of the most militant Hamas leader, Khaled Mashal. He's in exile in Damascus, who called for, in the international press, called for the establishment of a truly sovereign and independent Palestinian state on the territories occupied by Israel in June 1967. Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah has repeatedly stated that as a Lebanese organization, Hezbollah will not disrupt anything agreed to by the Palestinians, and a very large majority of Americans also accept this outcome. So in brief, the rejectionism of the U.S.-Israeli alliance is not only consistent over the past 35 years, but is also close to unilateral, as the record shows. There's a good reason why facts are omitted in the presentations of Annapolis, or in fact most commentary. The official story that I sampled before is the exact opposite of the truth, as a look at the actual record will show. Actually, the basic contours of a settlement are well understood. They were approached at Taba. And if the Annapolis conference were at all serious, it would take off from there, and it would complete the negotiations that were coming very close to a successful resolution when Israel abruptly terminated them. There are barriers to implementing the international consensus. The primary barriers happen to be right here, which is a very optimistic conclusion, I think, because it means that the possibility of serious moves towards accommodation lie within our hands.